The grand concert hall shimmered with elegance, its chandeliers casting a soft glow across the marble floors. The air was filled with the murmur of excited whispers and the clinking of fine wine glasses as the upper echelon of Charleston society gathered for the annual Young Musicians Gala. It was the kind of event where success was measured by the cost of the ticket, the reputation of the performers, and the size of the donor's check. Only the most talented and privileged teens were allowed to grace this stage, each with a future already paved in gold. Amidst the crowd of critics, donors, and well-dressed parents, the spotlight belonged to Charlotte Whitmore, a 17-year-old prodigy from one of the wealthiest tech families in the country. Charlotte had already won more state competitions than she could count, performed at Carnegie Hall twice, and was on her way to a scholarship at Juilliard. Her reputation preceded her, and she wore it like a crown. With her sky-blue gown draped elegantly over her lithe frame, Charlotte was the epitome of poise and confidence. As she stood backstage, waiting for her cue, she ran her fingers through the air, practicing the motions of the piano piece she had memorized so many times before. Her face was a mask of concentration, but beneath it lay the knowledge that tonight's performance would solidify her place in the world of elite musicians. However, the music hall, filled with its glitzy atmosphere and the weight of expectation, was not without its distractions. As the elite crowd mingled and the performers prepared, an unlikely figure slipped unnoticed through the backstage doors. A janitor in a faded gray uniform, pushing a squeaky cart that rattled as it moved. Raymond, as his name agreed, was in his late 60s, with a face weathered by time and work, and a pair of eyes that seemed to have seen far too much of the world's harsh realities. He had worked at the gala every year for as long as anyone could remember, never once being noticed, never once being appreciated. His job was to clean, to polish, to make sure the glittering hallways and bathrooms were immaculate for the guests, all while his presence was barely acknowledged by anyone. But tonight, something would be different. Raymond wasn't the type to interfere or make waves. He kept to his corner, his hands always busy with the mundane tasks that others found beneath them. But the grand piano in the center of the stage, the Steinway Grand, the one reserved for the most illustrious of performers, captured his attention in a way nothing else ever had. It wasn't the first time he had seen such an instrument. No, Raymond had played the piano in his younger years, before life had thrown its endless series of punches. But now, as he stood before it, the memories stirred within him. The once beautiful melodies he had played as a young man, the music that had been the soundtrack of his dreams, had long since been buried beneath years of cleaning up after others. As he dusted around the piano, Raymond's fingers brushed the keys lightly, almost by accident. A low murmur spread through the room as eyes shifted toward him. But it wasn't just Raymond's touch that caused the stir. It was the fact that he dared to touch the sacred piano. Charlotte, who had been busy warming up for her big moment, was the first to react. Her voice rang out, sharp and mocking. "What are you doing?" she called, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "That's not a toy. You can't just touch that. Do you even know what this is?" The laughter from the group of performers standing behind her was immediate, echoing through the hall like a chorus of judgment. Charlotte was known for her biting sarcasm and her disdain for anyone who didn't fit into her world of perfection and privilege. Raymond looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet calm. He hadn't meant to draw attention to himself, but something about the way she spoke, the way she belittled him, stirred something deep within. "I was just checking the polish," he said softly, almost to himself, his voice a low hum in the sea of laughter. Charlotte scoffed. "Leave that to the professionals," she said with a roll of her eyes. "Your job is to clean, not pretend to be a musician." More laughter followed, and Raymond felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, some pitying, some amused, others just plain cruel. But he didn't move. Instead, something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt in years. Without a word, Raymond gently set down his cart. He pulled out the bench from beneath the piano, his hand steady despite the whispers growing louder around him. As he sat down, the room fell into a strange hush. For a moment, no one knew what to expect. The laughter had died, replaced by a tense stillness that was almost tangible. Raymond, his fingers hovering over the keys, took a deep breath. The music, the melodies of his youth, seemed to call out to him. The years of silence, of ignoring his own dreams, fell away as his fingers gently brushed against the polished surface of the piano. The first note rang out, soft and full of sorrow. Then another, and another, until the air in the room shifted, the weight of his playing sinking deep into the hearts of those listening. The music was haunting, filled with a depth that no one had expected from the quiet janitor who had just been mocked. Each note seemed to carry a piece of his soul, a history too painful to speak, but one that could be felt in every chord he played. As Raymond's hands moved with precision, his fingers dancing over the keys, it was clear this was no mere cleaning man. This was a master. The audience, once filled with ridicule, now sat frozen. Eyes wide, jaws slack. The room had been silenced by the sheer power of the music. No one could breathe, no one could move. It was as if time had stopped. And in that moment, Raymond's music became the only thing that mattered. From the back of the room, an older man, a veteran music critic, shifted in his seat. His seasoned ears had heard the finest pianists in the world, but the beauty of Raymond's music, raw and real, was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the janitor, who had once been nothing but invisible to everyone in this hall. Charlotte stood still, her mouth hanging open, the arrogance draining from her face. The crowd around her had grown quiet, stunned into silence. Even her peers, the other performers who had once laughed at Raymond, now watched with wide eyes, unable to look away. Raymond's fingers continued to move, the music telling a story of loss, resilience, and the beauty of things long forgotten. The sound of the piano echoed through the hall, each note a testament to the power of hidden talent and the power of silence, the kind that can only be broken by something truly extraordinary. And as the final note lingered in the air, Raymond stopped playing. He sat back, his hands resting gently on the keys. The room was still. It was as if no one dared to move. For a brief moment, everything, every judgment, every expectation, every sneer had been shattered. Raymond, the janitor, had done what no one else could. He had shown them all the power of music, the depth of human emotion, and the undeniable truth that greatness does not always come in the form we expect. And just like that, the world would never be the same again. The silence that followed Raymond's performance was deafening. The kind of silence that wrapped itself around each person in the room, squeezing the air out of their lungs until they couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of realization, the understanding that something profound had just unfolded before their eyes, and they were too stunned to process it. Charlotte stood frozen, her wide eyes locked on the old man sitting at the piano, his gnarled hands resting lightly on the keys as if he was still in the midst of playing a song that no one could hear. Her jaw had gone slack, the arrogance that had once painted her features completely gone. Her world, one that had been so carefully constructed around her brilliance and privilege, had been shattered in a single beautiful moment of music. Raymond didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He had nothing to prove. The music had already done that for him. The crowd, still in a stunned stupor, slowly began to stir. Whispers began to ripple through the air, like a breeze stirring leaves in the fall. It started with one person, then another, and soon it was a wave of murmurs, questions, and disbelief. "Who is he?" someone whispered from the back. "That was incredible. I didn't know he could play like that," another person muttered, the admiration creeping into their voice. One by one, the audience members slowly began to acknowledge what they had just witnessed. They had come to the gala with expectations of witnessing the talent of young prodigies like Charlotte, whose name they had heard 100 times before, whose brilliance had been promised to them by the world's elite music critics. But what they had just seen was not what they had anticipated. Raymond, the humble janitor, had played with a rawness that none of them had ever experienced before. It wasn't perfect in the way they were accustomed to. There were no flawless runs, no dazzling flourishes. But it was perfect in a different, more intangible sense. It was real. It was pure. And for the first time in years, it was honest. Charlotte, still standing with her mouth agape, couldn't tear her gaze away from him. Her fingers, once so sure and confident when they touched the keys of her own piano, now felt useless. She had been the golden child, the one everyone had expected to succeed. She had been the one who had been told from a young age that her future was already written for her. But now she felt small, so much smaller than she had ever allowed herself to feel. The weight of her arrogance, the cruelty she had so often shown others, began to sink in. She had laughed at him, mocked him, dismissed him as just a janitor, a man whose life was dedicated to cleaning up the messes of people far more important than him. And now she was the one who was exposed, the one who had been revealed for what she truly was, just another young girl pretending to be untouchable, pretending to be above it all. Raymond, for his part, had not moved. He simply sat there, his fingers still resting lightly on the piano keys, his face calm. He had no need for the applause that was slowly beginning to trickle in. He didn't care for the admiration. It was never about that for him. It had never been about recognition or fame. It was about the music, always about the music. In the back of the room, an older man, one of the critics who had come to evaluate the young performers, shifted in his seat. His heart raced, and he found himself struggling to catch his breath. He had seen countless performances, countless young pianists who had been groomed for this very moment. He had heard all the expected notes, all the expected techniques, all the expected perfection. But this was different. This was something he had never encountered before. Raymond had played with the kind of depth that only comes from life experience. His music was not the product of hours spent in practice rooms, nor was it the product of privileged upbringing or expensive tutors. It was the product of a lifetime of pain, of struggle, of surviving the harshest of circumstances. It was a language that no one in this room understood, not until now. The critic leaned forward, his hands clenched tightly on the armrests of his seat. His mind raced as he thought about the unspoken rules of the music world, the rules that had always dictated who could perform, who could be great, and who could be ignored. Raymond, with his worn hands and humble uniform, had broken every one of those rules. A few rows ahead, one of the performers, a young boy who had been practicing for months to prepare for his own spot on the stage, now sat with his eyes wide. He had been one of those who had laughed at Raymond earlier, joining in with the others as they mocked the janitor for daring to touch a grand piano. But now he felt shame settle deep within him. He had never heard music like Raymond's. He had never felt music like that. The young boy swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at his hands, which had been practicing scales for hours every day, and suddenly felt unsure of his own abilities. What did it mean to be a musician? Was it just about technical skill? Was it just about following the rules, hitting the right notes, playing the right keys? Or was it something deeper, something more human? The room, once filled with the snobbish chatter of the elite, now stood frozen in place, caught between disbelief and awe. Everyone knew that tonight's performance would be one to remember, but no one could have anticipated this. No one could have predicted that the most profound, the most moving performance of the evening would come from the most unexpected source. As Raymond finally stood up from the piano, he gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging the crowd's stunned reaction. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't care about the reaction. He had given them something far more valuable than their praise. He had given them a glimpse into a world they had never understood, a world of music, of life, of struggle, and of triumph. Charlotte, still in her stunned silence, finally found her voice. It was small, almost hesitant, but it carried a weight that none of her previous words had ever held. "Thank you," she whispered, the words coming out of her mouth almost as if she was speaking to herself more than anyone else. Raymond gave her a quick, kind glance, and then, without a word, he turned and walked back toward his cart, his worn shoes tapping softly against the marble floor. The crowd, still reeling from what they had just witnessed, began to murmur amongst themselves once again. But this time, the conversation was different. It wasn't about Charlotte's upcoming performance or the status of the other prodigies in the room. It wasn't about who had the most expensive gown or who had the best chance at a scholarship. This time, the conversation was about the music, about the janitor who had changed everything with just a few chords, who had reminded them all that true talent is not measured by wealth, status, or privilege. It was measured by something far deeper. It was measured by the soul. The night had taken on a different kind of energy. What had begun as a carefully curated event for the elite, an evening meant to showcase the polished talents of the rich and the famous, had transformed into something entirely unexpected. The music that had once felt like a backdrop to the evening's grandeur now felt like the heartbeat of the room. The air, thick with the lingering notes of Raymond's impromptu performance, held a sense of reverence that no one had anticipated. Charlotte stood in the corner of the room, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of her gown. She had long since shed the composure that she had entered the event with. The arrogance that had once radiated from her like an invisible force now felt like a distant memory. Her thoughts were racing, tumbling over one another like a chaotic storm. She couldn't shake the image of Raymond's hands on the keys, the way his music had seemed to transport him to another world, a world where nothing else mattered except the story being told through his playing. Her entire life had been a carefully orchestrated symphony of success. Every note, every gesture had been preordained by those who had raised her, by her wealthy, influential parents, by the music instructors who saw her as a shining star. Charlotte had been praised for her flawless technique, her ability to play pieces that took years to master. And yet, in one single moment, a janitor had shown her a truth that she had never considered. It wasn't about technique. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about the status that came with being the chosen one in the music world. It was about the soul. For the first time in her life, she felt small, not in the way she had been small as a child, when she had been afraid to stand up to her parents or teachers, but in a more profound, humbling way. She had been so focused on impressing others, on maintaining the image of the perfect young prodigy, that she had neglected what it truly meant to be an artist. Raymond, the janitor, had taught her that lesson in a way that had shaken her to her very core. She didn't know how to process it, how to face the truth that had been laid bare before her. The sharp edge of her pride, once so solid and unmoving, felt as though it was beginning to crack. Charlotte had spent so long in a world where only the polished, the perfect, the privileged were worthy of recognition that she had forgotten the most important thing of all, the power of authenticity. Her mind turned back to the moments after Raymond had finished playing, to the way the crowd had reacted. It had taken them a while to find their voices, to understand what they had just witnessed. She had felt it too, that rawness in the air, that palpable shift in the energy of the room. It wasn't about applause or accolades. It was about something far deeper, something intangible that only those who had truly lived could understand. The young boy, the one who had laughed at Raymond earlier, now stood by the door, his face pale. He was holding his violin case tightly, as if the weight of it had suddenly become unbearable. Charlotte recognized the look in his eyes, the same look she had seen in herself before, when she had struggled with self-doubt after her first public performance. The boy was realizing that music was not just about practice, it was about life. And life, for many of them in that room, was something they had yet to truly experience. It was something they had taken for granted. For a moment, Charlotte's gaze met his. She saw the confusion, the embarrassment, but also the flicker of something else, a spark of realization. It was the same spark that had ignited within her when she had first heard Raymond's music. It was the realization that there was more to the world than the controlled, curated environments they lived in. There was a wildness to life, a rawness, that couldn't be replicated in a practice room or a concert hall. It couldn't be polished with lessons or molded with fame. Charlotte turned her attention back to Raymond. He was standing near the piano, wiping his hands slowly on his faded apron, his back to the crowd. He didn't care for their admiration or their astonished whispers. He wasn't seeking recognition. He had given them something far more important than applause. He had given them a glimpse of truth, of something pure. He had shown them what it meant to truly live through music. Charlotte glanced at the piano again, her eyes narrowing in concentration. The grand Steinway that had been reserved for the elite, for the chosen, now looked different to her. It no longer felt like a symbol of privilege or perfection. Instead, it felt like an instrument of possibility, of transformation. She had always seen it as a barrier, a line between those who had access and those who didn't. But Raymond had shown her that the piano was not just for the privileged. It was for anyone with the courage to touch it, to let the music speak from within. In that moment, Charlotte knew that she had to change. She couldn't go back to her old ways, to the polished performances, the rehearsed smiles, the endless cycle of competing for validation. There had to be more than that. Raymond had lived his entire life without seeking approval, without caring about the judgment of others. He had played for the sake of playing, for the love of the music. And that was what she wanted too. She wanted to play for herself, not for the audience, not for her parents, not for the critics. She wanted to be free. But the path forward was unclear. Charlotte felt a pang of fear as she thought about her future. Could she truly change everything she had built? Could she walk away from the world that had given her so much praise and success? She had spent years crafting this persona, this image of the perfect prodigy. Could she let go of all of that? Could she face the truth that she had been living a life for others, not for herself? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The thought of change was terrifying, but the thought of remaining the same was even worse. She couldn't deny what she had learned from Raymond. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something inside her had shifted forever. The music he had played was still alive in her, echoing in the back of her mind. It had opened a door inside her, and she knew there was no going back. As Charlotte continued to watch the crowd, she saw a few familiar faces, her parents, the judges, the other performers. They were still buzzing with excitement, discussing Raymond's impromptu performance, as if it was just another story to tell. But she knew that for her, it was more than that. It was a turning point, a moment that would define the rest of her life. She had been given the gift of perspective, and now she had to decide what to do with it. Raymond had left the piano, quietly slipping away into the shadows of the backstage area, his task complete. No applause followed him, no recognition, just the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. And yet, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He had given her the one thing she had been missing, the courage to be authentic. For the rest of the evening, Charlotte couldn't focus on the performances. She tried to play her piece later in the program, but the notes felt hollow rehearsed. She was no longer playing for the judges or the audience. She was playing for herself. And she wasn't sure if the music she had practiced for years could ever compare to the raw, soul-stirring performance she had just witnessed. When the evening came to a close, the audience began to filter out of the hall, still buzzing about the mysterious janitor who had stolen the show. Charlotte lingered behind, lost in her thoughts. She wasn't ready to face her parents, her teachers, the people who had built her career. Not yet. She needed time to process, to understand what had happened. She needed time to figure out who she was without the mask of perfection. As she left the hall, the cool night air hit her, and she took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of possibility. The world felt different now. The weight of her success didn't feel as heavy, and for the first time, she realized that she didn't need to carry it alone. She could let go. She could be free. Charlotte didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never look at music, or life, the same way again. Raymond had shown her that there was power in vulnerability, strength in authenticity, and that true greatness came not from being the best, but from being true to oneself. As she walked into the night, the first notes of her own journey began to play in her heart, and she was ready to listen. And Charlotte, for the first time in a long while, felt something shift within her. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. She felt an intense need to understand, to know what it was that Raymond had tapped into. What did it mean to play from the heart? What did it mean to be truly alive, truly present in the moment? Raymond's performance had exposed something she had buried deep inside herself. The desire to connect with something real. The desire to stop playing for others, to stop performing for applause, and to start playing for herself. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had been living her entire life for the approval of others, for the praise that came from winning competitions and being called the best. But she had never asked herself what it meant to play for the love of the music, to create something that was hers and hers alone. She had never allowed herself to just be. For the first time in her life, Charlotte wasn't thinking about her next performance, her next competition. She wasn't thinking about how she would be seen, how she would be judged. She was thinking about something else, something more important. She was thinking about the possibility of creating, not for anyone else, but for herself. The idea of letting go, of surrendering to the music, of playing with her heart instead of her head, filled her with both excitement and fear. The grand hall, once bustling with the hum of affluent chatter and clinking glasses, now felt distant and unreal. The chandeliers, the polished floors, the expensive gowns, all of it faded into the background as she stood there, feeling something stir within her that had been dormant for years. She no longer felt like the star of the show. In that moment, she felt like a student, a beginner, someone who had just been introduced to a deeper world she had never known. Raymond's performance had given her more than a lesson in music. It had given her a lesson in life. The lesson of being humble. The lesson of playing for the joy of creation, not for the reward of validation. The lesson of being true to oneself, even when the world expects you to be something different. She didn't know what would happen after tonight. She didn't know if she would change overnight, if she would suddenly become the musician she had always dreamed of being. But one thing was certain, she would never be the same. Raymond had shown her that there was more to music than technique, more to life than achievement. And for the first time in years, Charlotte felt as though she had discovered a piece of herself that she had been searching for all along. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, and as Charlotte looked back at Raymond, she knew that the real performance had just begun. The room was still buzzing, but now there was a hum of reflection, a reverberation of change that had touched everyone, even if they didn't fully understand it. The tension that had clung to the air just moments ago had dissipated, replaced by a profound silence. For the first time, the crowd wasn't focused on the performance, the judges, or the prodigy on stage. They were focused on something far more powerful, the transformative moment they had just witnessed. Charlotte stood motionless, her heart racing as she processed what had just happened. She had entered the evening as the center of attention, convinced that this was her moment to shine, to reaffirm her place as the chosen one, the prodigy destined for greatness. She had rehearsed every note, every gesture, every smile. Everything was in place for her grand entrance. But in the span of a few minutes, everything had unraveled, and she was left standing there, grappling with a truth she had never been prepared for. Raymond had been the catalyst for her transformation, but the realization wasn't immediate. She didn't have the luxury of fully understanding everything in that single moment. It would take days, weeks, even months to comprehend the depths of what had happened. But she knew this. Raymond's music had stripped away the layers of pretense that she had so carefully built around herself. He had shown her a part of music and life that she had never known. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about pleasing others. It was about playing with soul, with raw emotion, without concern for judgment. As she slowly made her way across the room, her mind whirred with 1,000 questions. What had Raymond's music awakened in her? Why had it felt like she had been transported to another world, A world where nothing else mattered except the beauty of the moment. It wasn't just the melody or the technical mastery. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite put into words. The days following the gala were a blur for Charlotte. The world she had once known seemed distant, almost foreign now. Her every movement felt like she was walking in someone else's shoes, as though she were seeing life from a different angle. It wasn't just the music that had shifted something inside her. It was the entire evening. The way Raymond had played with such rawness and vulnerability, and how it had exposed her own limitations. She spent hours each day in front of her piano, but it wasn't the same. The notes she played felt stiff, mechanical. The perfect technique that had once been her pride now felt empty. She no longer sought perfection. She didn't want to play just to impress anyone or win applause. She wanted to play for something deeper, something that resonated with the core of who she was. Her parents noticed the change almost immediately. Charlotte had always been the star of their world, their pride, their success story. But now, when they asked her about her next performance, her competition, or her future, Charlotte found herself at a loss for words. She didn't know what to say. The pressure, the expectations, they had all seemed so important before, but now they felt suffocating. Her mother, ever the perfectionist, pushed her to stay focused, to prepare for the next big concert that would no doubt bring more recognition. "You've worked so hard, Charlotte," she said one afternoon as they sat together at the kitchen table, her voice light, but carrying an edge of concern. "The gala was just a minor setback. You can still go on and prove yourself. The world is watching, and you can't let one moment of uncertainty derail your future." But Charlotte didn't want to prove herself anymore. The more her mother spoke, the more Charlotte realized that she no longer cared about the world's approval. Her mother's words felt hollow now. She wasn't sure how to explain this to her, so she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the untouched cup of tea in front of her. Instead, Charlotte found herself thinking about Raymond. She had tried to push the memory of his music from her mind, but it lingered like an unshakable melody that haunted her every waking moment. She could still hear his notes, the way they seemed to speak directly to her soul. It was as though his performance had unlocked something inside her that she had never known existed. That afternoon, as Charlotte was walking through the city streets, a thought struck her. She had been so focused on mastering the piano, on becoming the best, that she had forgotten why she had started playing in the first place. Music had always been her escape, her sanctuary. It had been a way to express herself when words failed. But somewhere along the way, it had become a tool for validation, a means to an end, rather than the beautiful, soul-stirring experience it was meant to be. With this realization came a wave of clarity. Charlotte knew what she needed to do. She needed to return to her roots. She needed to play for herself, not for an audience, not for a judge, not for her parents. She needed to find the joy in music again. And perhaps, just as importantly, she needed to understand the value of failure. She needed to embrace vulnerability, to let go of the perfectionism that had held her hostage for so long. The next morning, Charlotte made a decision. She would visit the concert hall, the very place where everything had shifted for her. She wanted to sit at that piano again, the same Steinway that Raymond had played with such quiet dignity. It wasn't about proving something to anyone. It wasn't about impressing anyone with her skill. It was about reconnecting with the music, about rediscovering that piece of herself she had lost in the pursuit of excellence. When she arrived at the hall, the space felt different without the bustling crowd. It was quiet now, empty except for a few cleaning staff, and the sound of the occasional footstep echoing through the cavernous space. Charlotte walked up to the piano, her fingers brushing the polished wood. It felt strange, almost intimate, like coming home after being away for far too long. She took a deep breath and sat down on the bench. The air in the hall seemed to hold its breath as she lifted her hands to the keys. But instead of diving into the familiar, structured pieces she had always played, Charlotte closed her eyes and let her fingers find their own way. She wasn't following sheet music. She wasn't thinking about technique or performance. She was just playing. The first notes were hesitant, tentative, but slowly they grew stronger, more confident. The music flowed through her, not from her, as if she were channeling something much bigger than herself. Each note felt like a release, a letting go of the expectations, the judgments, the years of being told what she should be. The melody she played was nothing like the pieces she had performed at galas or competitions. It was raw, unpolished, filled with emotion. And as she played, Charlotte could feel the music pouring out of her, filling the empty spaces inside her that had been hollowed out by years of striving for perfection. It wasn't perfect. There were mistakes. There were moments where her fingers stumbled, where the notes didn't quite come out as she had hoped. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling that accompanied the music, the sense of freedom, of release, of connection to something far greater than the notes on the page. She played for what felt like hours, lost in the music. And when she finally stopped, her hands resting lightly on the keys, Charlotte realized that something inside her had shifted once more. She had found what she had been searching for all along: peace. The peace that comes from accepting imperfection, from embracing the beauty of vulnerability, from playing not for anyone else but for herself. For the first time in a long while, Charlotte didn't feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. She didn't feel the pressure to be the best or to live up to the expectations of those around her. She felt free, and that, she realized, was the greatest gift of all. As she stood up and walked away from the piano, Charlotte knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt and insecurity, but she was no longer afraid of them. She had learned from Raymond that the most powerful music and the most powerful life is one lived authentically, with vulnerability, and with the courage to embrace imperfection. The future was uncertain, but Charlotte was ready to face it, not as the perfect prodigy, but as someone who had finally discovered the power of playing her own song. And that was enough. Charlotte's transformation didn't happen overnight, and the journey wasn't as clear-cut as she might have hoped. The initial sense of liberation she felt after her impromptu visit to the concert hall quickly gave way to doubt. The outside world, the one she had spent her whole life curating, was still there. Her parents still had their expectations, her teachers still pushed for perfection, and her peers still had their own idea of what she should be. The pressure of maintaining the image of a flawless prodigy loomed over her like a dark cloud, threatening to overshadow her newfound sense of self. But Charlotte had changed. She could feel it deep inside, even if the world around her couldn't see it yet. The journey wasn't about everyone else understanding her new perspective. It was about her own internal shift. She was no longer willing to play by the rules others had set for her. She had learned that it wasn't about being perfect or following a prescribed path. It was about discovering her own voice, about playing with heart, and about being true to herself. One afternoon, Charlotte found herself sitting in the park near her home, watching the world go by. The sky was overcast, but there was a peaceful stillness in the air. The sound of children playing in the distance, the rustling of leaves in the trees, all of it seemed to speak to her in ways that were hard to put into words. She had spent so many years inside the world of music halls and rehearsals that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be, to simply exist without the constant pressure to achieve. It was here, in the quiet of the park, that Charlotte realized just how far removed she had become from the real world. She had lived in a bubble of competition, awards, and praise, but she had never really experienced life as it was meant to be lived, raw, unfiltered, and full of moments that didn't require perfection. The world outside was messy, unpredictable, and yet, somehow, more beautiful than anything she had experienced in her sheltered existence. The weight of her realization hit her hard. She had to confront the fact that she had spent the last few years chasing after approval, seeking validation from people who didn't truly know her. Her success in the music world had been built on a foundation of external accolades, not on a deep connection to her own passions and emotions. It had been about the performance, the applause, the the gold medals and awards. Things that were so fleeting, so temporary. But now, as she sat there, she understood that the true beauty of life, and of music, was found in the quiet moments, the moments when you stopped trying to be something you weren't. It was about finding joy in the simple act of playing, of letting your soul speak through the keys, not worrying about whether it was the right note or the wrong one. For the first time, Charlotte understood that music wasn't just about technique. It was about expression, about vulnerability, and about telling the truth of your heart. Over the next few weeks, Charlotte began to withdraw from the rigid, competitive world she had once inhabited. She stopped practicing for the upcoming competitions and recitals that had once filled her calendar. Instead, she spent her time playing for herself. She returned to the piano in the solitude of her room, not as a prodigy seeking approval, but as a young woman trying to reconnect with the love she had once had for music. She let herself play freely, experimenting with sounds and melodies that had no clear structure. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about rediscovering the joy of playing. Her parents, of course, noticed the change. They were confused at first, perhaps even frustrated, but Charlotte could see the subtle shift in them as well. They no longer pushed her to perform, to compete, to win. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken recognition that their daughter was no longer the perfect prodigy they had hoped she would be. But Charlotte had come to realize that she didn't need to be perfect for them, or for anyone else. She needed to be herself. One evening, as Charlotte sat at the piano, she received an unexpected call. It was from the very same music critic who had been in the audience the night Raymond played. His voice was warm and inviting as he spoke to her about her performance at the gala, though he hadn't been as complimentary in his initial review. "Charlotte," he said, "I've been following your work for years, and I have to tell you, I was impressed by your response to what happened that night. Most performers would have been offended by Raymond's interruption, but you seemed to understand something deeper. You saw beyond the surface, beyond the performance, to the heart of the music. That's something rare." His words struck Charlotte with the force of a truth she had been grappling with for so long. It wasn't the accolades or the reviews that mattered most. It was how she touched people, how she made them feel. She had spent so long trying to perfect her technique, trying to measure up to some standard of greatness, that she had lost sight of the real purpose of music: to move people, to make them feel something, anything. "Charlotte," the critic continued, "I'd like to see you perform again. Not as the star prodigy, but as yourself. A performance for the soul. No expectations, just the music. What do you think?" For the first time in a long while, Charlotte smiled genuinely. She didn't have to think twice. "I'd love to," she said softly, her voice filled with newfound confidence. And so, Charlotte prepared for her next performance, not as the girl who had everything to prove, but as someone who had learned to let go. She invited a small audience, only a few close friends, some family, and a handful of people who genuinely appreciated music for its own sake, not for the status it brought. The performance was held in a modest concert hall, far from the grandeur of the galas and competitions she had once dominated. As she stepped onto the stage, Charlotte felt an unfamiliar but comforting sense of peace. She was nervous, but not in the way she had been before. This time, it wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about being true to herself and letting her music speak. When she began to play, it was nothing like the polished, rehearsed pieces she had performed countless times before. The music was raw, unrefined, and full of emotion. Each note felt like a part of her soul being revealed to the world. It was imperfect, beautiful, and uniquely her. As the final note echoed through the hall, Charlotte looked up and saw the faces of the small audience. They were not applauding out of obligation or because they had to. They were moved. They understood. And for the first time in her life, Charlotte knew that she didn't need anything more than that. Raymond had shown her the way. He had taught her that the heart of music and of life lay in vulnerability, in honesty, in embracing the imperfect beauty that made each moment so precious. Charlotte had finally found her voice, not as the world expected her to be, but as she truly was. And as the audience rose to their feet, not in applause, but in silent acknowledgement, Charlotte felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. She had made it, not to the top of the charts, not to the headlines of music magazines, but to a place of peace, of self-acceptance. And that, she realized, was the greatest performance of all.